Hello and welcome to an overview of the first portion of our preview review for Research Methods Exam 2, Round 1. The first thing I want to talk about is if you were going to interview someone, or if you were going to propose research to a specific group or community, you would need to contact them. One of the most common ways that we contact people in this day and age is through email. You might start with dear first name, last name, and noting that if the person is a PhD or medical doctor, then you need to use the preface doctor unless they're a full professor, in which case you would use the preface of professor, first name and last name. Please use professional titles where applicable, professor, director, doctor, etc. Begin by explaining the purpose of your email, that as a part of your research, you're interviewing those with expertise on your topic, and would they in principle be willing to be interviewed? Always state your status, discipline, and in a one-liner just about your research. This is usually, for example, your thesis or your research question or both, but nothing too lengthy. Then state why you're contacting them, whether it's the purpose for an interview or the kind of research you'd like to conduct. Be kind, be polite, thank them for their time. A never popular, formal, traditional, respectful ending remains the classic sincerely, first name, last name. That's the general overview. However, the question remains, do you include the questions the first time around? Well, that depends. If you're doing a survey and sending it to tons of people, then you would include the link. If the interview is with someone you know, then the level of formality changes. Personally, I like to start by inquiring if they are in principle happy to be interviewed and give a couple of examples of the short questions I'd be asking. I then wait and see if they agree. If they agree, I explain the process that I need their permission to use the information I would garner and get them to finally say, or I would eventually finally explain to them how that information would be used. So after the process is done, after I've transcribed the interview, I would then decide what I was using and I would inform them of it so that they have the final say in whether or not they want that information to still be shared. I would, after all that, send the questions and arrange for a time for the interview. Remember to get whomever you're interviewing to sign permission forms and remember to follow up with them afterwards. Discussion of thesis overall structure. We do not have a formal thesis guide to my knowledge at this time, but I believe one is in the works, and by the time I posted this, who knows, it might be there already. I will follow up on this topic with you um, later on. Now, in our case, we are using that formal guide. So let me jump back for a moment. Nope, that's something I'm reading, which happens to be an excellent read. But what I'm really looking for is over here. Okay, I am in the comprehensive form. So what you'll be doing at this stage for our discussion is this comprehensive cumulative form. Research methods used to be a preparation for a senior thesis and for the thesis process for graduate students, but at the moment, we're just using this cumulative form that you're completing for the purposes of this course. Right. So I have a couple of what we call guest video lectures, and whenever we look at these, and these could be helpful to you in the wording of surveys and in structuring a semi-structured interview. Always ask what their purpose was, what style of presentation, the intended audience was, and if the presentation was successful and why, and what your general thoughts are. Now, if you're attending one of our optional in-person sessions, then we would be watching these together and talking about them. If you're doing this on your own, then again, these are guidelines for how to watch the videos. And now for something completely different, a review of Boolean logic. Using Venn diagrams to discuss Boolean logic in relation to the searching for for library resources. Introduction to the use of logic in creating interview instrumentation, introduction to the use of operant conditioning and social dynamics in relation to preparing for interviews. Venn diagrams, truth tables, Boolean logic. Boolean logic search strategies use binary operators such as and, or, and not. We've talked about this in the past. Um, and is the Venn intersection of two sets, a logical conjunction requiring both the premise and a conclusion to be true. All other options are considered false. Or is the Venn union of two sets. Only one premise must be true for the conclusion to be true, and not is a negation factor that delimits possible results of the search. We are going to focus upon and or not, using an analogy of being very hungry. And if I like bananas with ice cream, but do not like either on their own, I would be using the and. Now, this seems a little counterintuitive. We'd like to think of and as encompassing both, but in Boolean logic, that is reserved for the inclusive or. And is a way of saying that I must have both of the items specified, not just one or the other or both. So in this case, we see if this is bananas and this section, this circle is ice cream, the intersection is really what I'm asking for in the Boolean search option. Again, in an event intersection of two sets, both the premise and conclusion need to be true. All other options are false, are not what we're looking for or using. Therefore, what must I have in my ice cream bowl or my banana bowl or my dish? There's only one true option. I must have both bananas and ice cream. This is perhaps again counterintuitive, but let's also look at this in terms of a truth table. So if I have bananas and that's in my bowl, and I have ice cream and that's in my bowl, then I have banana and ice cream in my bowl. That is the one true option that and means in a Boolean search context. Everything else is false because I have to have both of those for this to be the case. Now, in the case of or, Venn union of two sets, only one premise must be true for the conclusion to be true. So what goes in my bowl? Well, it could be just bananas, it could be just ice cream, or it could be both. So long as there is something. The only false outcome here would be if there were nothing. A false false would lead to a false. Or provides a broader response than one gets with and. So again, this circle represents bananas, this circle represents ice cream, this represents the intersection point between the two, and all of that is good. I'm happy to have the bananas, the ice cream, or have the two together. And we see that in our truth table as well. That the only stipulation is must have one or the other at the least. So all of those options are true. The only one that's false is when I have none. Not as a delimitation, not as used in the Boolean search to delimit or drop certain key terms or information from the search. Let's say you were interested in knowing about lunar landings, but did not want to know about Apollo 11, the most famous of those landings. Well, in that case, you might try keyword moon with the search operator or, and then keyword landing. And that's going to be quite inclusive. This is our inclusive or. But then if you add the operator not Apollo 11, then you should be getting everything about moon landing, but nothing that has a keyword of Apollo 11. Now, that's key here, that keyword, because if it's quite possible that someone has mentioned something about Apollo 11 within an article that is only used keywords of moon landing or moon landing. This could potentially give you fewer results, however, and I say potentially again because the search engines can be very particular. You might need to add one more not option or more a variety of not options in addition to avoid getting the result of Apollo 11. You might have to, for example, add not Apollo alone as well, for example. Elements of research design, defining types of research design. There are three basic types of research design that we look at. There's the random experiment design, also sometimes called a true experiment design, in which one incorporates critically the use of a random group assignment. The random truth experiment requires that a random group assignment be present. A non-experiment design is one in which a random group assignment is not present. A quasi-experiment design is one in which a random group assignment is not present and there are multiple groups and measurements used. That will make a little bit more sense in a moment. Let's look at the next slide. So here we have the issue of, is there a random group assignment present? If your answer is yes, then you have a random true experiment. If your answer is no, then it's a little more complex. We have to ask a few more questions. First, you have to ask, is there a control group present? In other words, you have to ask if, even though there's no random group present, if it's going along with the standard random true experiment structure in which you have, for example, a pretest, a post-test, and you've assigned two groups, a control group and a treatment group. So you ask, after looking at, is there a random group assignment? You've said no. You ask if there's a control group present. Now, if there is, and you say yes, you have a quasi-experiment. Now, quasi-experiment does not qualify as a true experiment or a random experiment because quasi-experiment does not have a random group present. However, it does usually follow that same pattern of having a control group, a treatment group, a pre-test, a post-test, those structures that go uh, along with the same pattern that a random group uh, experiment, a true experiment, would have. If there is no control group present, then your answer is no, and you have what we call a non-experiment experiment. Elements of research design, a random true experiment. In a random or true experiment, there is a comparison of some kind being made between a control group or untreated group and a treatment group. A pool of randomly chosen subjects are all usually subjected to a pretest of some kind to provide what is called a baseline response or normative response. The pool is then divided into two separate groups. One group, the treatment group, is provided with the treatment or program, the predictor variable, while the other group or control group is not. At the end of the experimental treatment, each group is given a post-test to determine what similarities or differences there are to the pretest findings. A true experiment seeks to find a cause and effect relationship. Non-experiment. Now, a non-experiment does not necessarily seek to find a cause and effect relationship, although it can potentially do so. In a non-experiment design, a random group assignment is not present. A non-experimental design ideally does not manipulate the subject of the research or the research context, but rather relies upon interpretation of interactions and relational dynamics. Non-experiments tend to be documentary in nature. They seek to gather information about a specific social context or condition rather than prove or disprove a specific fact. Quasi-experiment. We talked about this before. A quasi-experiment design is one in which a random group assignment is not present and there is a use of multiple groups and or measurements. In some ways, this form of research is either the best or the worst of all possible worlds. A quasi-experiment design allows the researcher to explore possible cause and effect relationships like a true experiment would, but because it is choosing its subject pool and context, there is an opportunity to gather documentary information with an interpretive treatment as well. As might be imagined, this approach is vulnerable to challenges about its validity, logical consistency, and soundness, inherent truth. And again, this quasi-experiment also requires that similar structure to the random one. They're pretty much the same, except for the factor that it is not a random choice. A quasi-experiment is specifically choosing its subject pool. But quite often, this quasi-experiment will again have two groups. It'll have a pretest, then divide the group into two groups, and it will have one treatment group and one control group, and then it'll have a post-test after whatever happens in the circumstance. Elements of research design, qualitative, quantitative, or both. Research data types, qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative data is a collection of facts or perceptions that may be readily interpreted in terms of values, character, or intuitive understanding. Quantitative data is a collection of facts or perceptions that may be readily analyzed by numerical and statistical methods. Sorry? The decision about what kind of data to rely upon is informed by the research context. In other words, whether you choose to do a true experiment, a non-experiment, or a quasi-experiment will provide information that lends itself to gathering either qualitative data or quantitative data. Elements of research design, prescriptive versus descriptive. In addition, the type of data the research project will rely upon it is important to consider if the project design is primarily prescriptive or descriptive. Now, prescriptive means that the project context has underlying assumptions, that there is an intentional agenda in the research process influencing the research subject. Now, I would argue that to a certain extent, uh, both the real experiment approach and the quasi-experiment approach have prescriptive qualities. You're creating a treatment group. You're actually testing a particular subject or treatment, and you have a control group, but treatment group, you have pre and post tests, as we've mentioned. You're trying to get usually a quantitative analysis that will tell you a particular cause and effect relationship. Descriptive means a project attempts to simply report and understand the subject of the research, and this is more common in social sciences. Prescriptive research practices, and again, descriptive is usually going to be a non-experiment structure as well. Prescriptive research practice, though once normative, has generally fallen out of fashion in the humanities and social sciences. Arguably, however, all research is culturally informed and therefore somewhat prescriptive. It is important to remain aware of how our personal values may or may not be influencing research design. Elements of research design, approaches. Now, I want to talk a little bit about different types of approaches. We have indigenous research methods, case studies, transformative, interpretive, and positivist. There's also pragmatic, which we've talked about in the past a little bit. Um, Indigenous approaches, indigenous research methodologies. This is an approach to research defined by members of indigenous nations for research of topics that directly concern them, their communities, their families. Um, and the researcher is a part of the research, and the research must be conducted in accordance with the community values and relational accountability. Case studies, media, documentary, participatory media. These are primarily types of research interested in observing and documenting the research subject, and then consequently using that documentation to increase social awareness, knowledge, and or answer particular questions about patterns of life and social behavior. These tend to be, again, a non-experiment approach because you're simply documenting what's there. And these may or may not be indigenous research methodologies. The person conducting the study may or may not be a part of the community that they are researching. Transformative research approaches are primarily concerned with using research to promote social justice and see research as an agency for change. Gender studies, disability studies, queer theory, postcolonial theory are all examples of transformative research approaches. Interpretive approaches seek to better understand the human condition by acknowledging that there are multiple realities Grounded theory is a good example of an interpretive research strategy. Grounded theory relies upon the process of generative questions, then reflexively analyzing those questions, coding, as well as the implications of the research process itself, memoing. For a good and concise discussion of this, we have other materials available in our course. uh, Pragmatic research design. And I remember I wanted to add this in because pragmatic approach to research design is primarily concerned with practical outcomes and is often used in education research, as we've discussed in previous sessions. Elements of research design, positivist Cartesian. Now, this positivist approach is essentially the scientific method, the Hegelian dialectic, Cartesian-based research method that asserts that there's one absolute reality and it is humanity's obligation to better understand that reality. The positivist paradigm research should be accomplished in accordance with the scientific method, which presupposes objectification of the subject for the study. It relies heavily upon sensory information and the replication of experimental results. This method continues to be the approach of choice in biochemistry and technology. About personal experience and consensus driven reality. Most Euro-Western research paradigms are essentially consensus driven. That is, knowledge is agreed upon by collective expertise. There are two ways that we know that something is true: internal experience and external experience. Internal experience has to do with our physical sensory perception, our wellness, our health, our interpretation of these experiences as well. The material or external experience has to do with the material world, how it exists outside of us, earth, shelter, food, water, weather, the things we are dependent upon, and also how we're taught to interpret that world by family, pets, friends, teachers, doctors, co-workers, total strangers, institutions, the judiciary, the government, churches, school, workplace, the mass media, and social media and mobile technology, all of which heavily influence our understanding of life in the world around us. Evaluation of information is based upon perception, interpretive experience, and causal relationships. Cartesian methods traditionally focus more upon quantitative data rather than qualitative data. In this session, we will primarily focus upon qualitative data or research methods, interviewing being one of those primary methods of qualitative research. So, is something true or not true? We check in with our internal experience and our external experience. Our internal experience being our physical sensory perception and interpretation of that perception. Our external experience being the influence of family, friends, uh, others in our world, the material world itself, the nature and the world in which we live, our institutions, the government, our workplace, and then mass media, social media, and mobile technologies. Qualitative research design includes participant observation, direct observation, unstructured interviewing, and case studies. Qualitative research design, specifically dealing with participant observation. This is when the researcher is either part of or becomes a part of the research context. The researcher is participant to the research topic and process. Indigenous research methodologies and participatory video both involve participant observation. Direct observation, in this case, the researcher seeks to be detached from the research subject and context. They're not a part of it. They strive to be unobtrusive, but they don't involve themselves or disrupt as best possible the topic or context of the research. In this case, think of David Attenborough and his nature programs. He may interview local populations about drought conditions and may observe how wildlife respond to those conditions, but he does not generally reside in the places he researches, nor directly identify as a part of their community. Formal interview. An interview is a means of gathering information directly from the subject of the study or from an expert on the subject of the study. There are two basic types of formal interview process, unstructured and structured interviews. Structured interviews are based upon or in some sense follow a pre-written and to a greater or lesser extent agreed upon script of questions, usually intent to achieve certain answers. The unstructured interview tends to be unscripted and or very loosely scripted with open general questions. Participatory or non-participatory video. Participatory video and media are created by the community or subject of the research. In this way, they are akin to participatory observation and are sometimes used in Indigenous research methodology studies. This kind of media research production may involve structured or unstructured interviews. Non-participatory video may also involve structured or unstructured videos and is akin to direct observation. It is commonly used in Cartesian, interpretive, and transformative types of research. Case study-based research projects use the stories and experiences of a particular subject or group to better understand a general condition or to propose a general condition. Much of the social sciences research is based upon case studies or case histories. Collections of experience over time tend to potentially support or disprove certain beliefs about the world. Information gathered for case studies always involves some form of material culture and documentation, such as the written word, textiles, photographs, paintings, objects, video, or audio recordings. All right, equivalence. Beware the opposition. Any methodology or research design will be subject to criticism. We live in times that tend to value quantitative research findings over qualitative research findings. This suggests a misapprehension of what good research is. Good research requires the appropriate approach, the right tool for the job, so to speak. Sometimes the best approach is qualitative, and sometimes it's quantitative. It all depends on the question one is asking. Guba and Lincoln in 1994 proposed one way of thinking about a conceptual equivalence for determining validity, logical structure, and soundness, truth, or credibility of qualitative data in comparison to quantitative research. So in quantitative research, we tend to look for internal validity, external validity, reliability, and objectivity. In comparison, in qualitative research, internal validity is more akin to credibility. External validity is more akin to transferability. Reliability is more akin to dependability, and objectivity is more in keeping with the concept of confirmability. Credibility is confidence in the findings of the research. Transferability means the research has useful implications and or applications for multiple disciplines or professions or contexts. Dependability is showing that the findings are consistent and may be repeated. Conformability means that the findings are true to the respondents and are not unduly biased by the researcher. These equivalencies are one way of thinking about how qualitative research may be justified and justifiable in European academia. So these are various elements of research design just for review, which you may review in your own time. Time being the most important part of research design. Of all of the factors one must consider creating in a research project, time is probably the most important resource to manage. Good questions to ask are, is there a temporal factor in my study? For example, if there is a pretest, how much time do I need to complete the treatment stage and the post-test? How much time do I have before my research findings need to be completed? How much time do I have for the writing up stage? We've also talked about the process of evaluation of truth invites certain questions. Basic questions to ask of potential sources of information for research include, does it agree with my own personal perception and experience? Does it agree with my own educational expertise? Is it peer reviewed? Does it have general support from its discipline or profession? Does it exhibit expertise on its chosen topic? Does it have some sort of research data or statistical report? Do other laudable sources agree with it? Is it properly formatted and written? Is it based upon primary sources or secondary sources? If it is based upon primary sources, how many primary sources? If it is based upon secondary sources, are they biased? Many thanks.